Hey everyone, it's White Cross, and this is the first advanced 999 video that we will be putting out here that talks about silver bars. So this is kind of a follow-up to the last couple of videos that were an advanced, deeper dive into 999 silver, and in those videos we talked about coins. And again, for the sake of brevity, we combined both coins and rounds into one video or a couple of videos. This one is that marked departure where we're going from those coin or coin-like items to bars. And there will be several videos in this series on bars. And we're going to take them in order of size. So this video, the first 999 advanced bar video, will be about the 1 ounce bars. And for me, the 1 ounce bars and the more advanced collector type products break down into three main categories. And not everybody categorizes bars the way that I do, but this is kind of from my perspective. I see them in these three categories. They are silver art bars, industrial bars, and then bank or investment bars. So three distinct categories: art bars, industrial, and banking. Before we get into those categories, I wanted to mention my common disclaimer that I try to put at the beginning of all of these videos. I'm not an investment counselor. I'm not trying to give you investment advice. This is my own experience having done this collecting and stacking precious metals for about 30 or 40 years now. And also, as we've done in the past, I wanted to include a few terms and concepts before we get into the meat of the items that we'll be talking about. And the concepts I want to kind of touch on was one that I touched on earlier, and that is bridging the gap between stacking and collecting. So if you are into these advanced topics that we're talking about, you've either already made this leap or you're considering making the leap. And an advanced topic is just the things that are a little bit more unusual, the things that are maybe a little bit older, the things that are a little bit more scarce. It's a departure from the strict investment vehicles of generic rounds, generic 10-ounce bars, or even things like silver eagles and silver maples. Nothing wrong with those items. Those are legitimate items to have if you've decided that you want to have physical precious metals. This is for people looking for things that are a little bit different, a little bit older, a little bit more scarce, and a little bit more collectible. So you have to decide what your comfort level is to bridge that gap, to make that leap between what is stacking and what is collecting. And the main thing you need to think about is premiums. How much more than the value of the precious metals are you willing to pay to get those items that are a little bit more unusual, a little bit more scarce? For me personally, it's a low amount. Unless something is truly exceptional, I don't like to spend a whole lot of money on premiums. I enjoy the chase, the searching, the looking, the seeking for those items. But it takes a lot of fun out of it for me if I have to pay a high premium. You may be entirely opposite. If you find something that you truly want and that you truly like, paying a high premium may be okay for you. Again, it's a personal preference. It's a journey that you have to make yourself, and you have to decide where your comfort level is. So that's kind of the concept, bridging that gap between stacking and collecting, and therefore how much more are you willing to pay for a premium. And a couple of definitions. While we're talking about bars, this didn't really come up when we were talking about the coin-like items, but bars really come in two different styles. That is the older style, which is a poured bar, where they literally took silver in a crucible and poured that molten metal into some kind of a blank or some kind of a mold that would kind of mimic the end result that they were looking for. So sometimes those molds actually had type in them where they typed the name of the company or the size of the bar or the weight of the bar or the purity of the bar. More often, the older bars in particular, they would pour the bar first, and then once the bar had cooled or partially cooled, they would stamp their name or stamp their weight or stamp their purity into the bars. So those are the older poured style bars. The other type of bar is an extruded or a milled or a minted bar. And that would be what you see here. Most of these are that style. So these are a little bit of a newer technology where they were trying to come up with a fit and finish that was a little bit more polished, a little bit more complete than just a poured bar. It's important to note those differences because there in the last 10 or 15 years has been a kind of a move to redoing those old style bars. This is something that has come back on the market. And allinglehard.com, a website that I've referenced before and that I think is a really great source of information for a lot of different types of these earlier, more collectible types of bullion. They make the distinction and they call those new bars retro. And I think that's a really good term to use. They are modern pieces that look like they're old, but they aren't necessarily old. They are retro. So be aware of that. If you're starting to get into these older bars, not everything that looks old is genuinely old. And if that's not a concern of yours, that's fine. Just be informed and be aware that sometimes those older looking bars could have been made last week. So, poured bars versus extruded bars, that's enough definitions. Let's get into the meat of it. Like I said before, to me at least, there are three distinct areas: the art bars, the industrial bars, and the banking bars. So let's start on the art bars. These really began to be popular about 1970, and they went up all the way through about 1975. That seems to be the golden era of these. There were examples that existed before, and there were examples that exist after that period of time. That really seems to be the time that was the golden era for art bars. What's an art bar? It's really one of the first 999 silver bars that was made for consumers. These weren't made by refiners and they weren't made for industrial purposes. They were actually made and sold to the consumer. And what kind of sparked their popularity and drove their popularity was that vacuum that was created by the absence of silver in our circulating coinage. And we've talked about that vacuum before. Up until 1965, our coins were made out of 90% silver, our dimes, our quarters, and our half dollars, and even our silver dollars. From 1965 through 1970, the Kennedy half dollars were made out of 40% silver. So we continued to make those items, those Kennedy half dollars, with at least 40% silver, all the way up until about 1970. If you wanted silver, it was always going to be out there in circulation, especially if you're talking about up until 1964, the last year that we had 90% circulating coinage. If you wanted or needed silver for any reason, be it for an industrial use, for making things at home, if you wanted it just as an investment vehicle, because people have always seen silver as money, you could literally go down to a bank and write a check or cash some bills and get rolls of silver dimes, silver quarters, silver half dollars. So it was really the final end of those JFKs being made out of 40% silver that I think kind of sparked all of this for all intents and purposes, the modern era of consumer 1 ounce and larger silver bars. Silver art bars were made for collectors. These were items that were made from many different mints. They were all making these types of bars, and they covered topics like politics. Being in the early 1970s, there were references to Vietnam, there was Nixon, and there was Spiro Agnew, and there was Henry Kissinger. There is the women's rights movement, suffrage. There's the Vietnam War. There is the oil embargo. Just about any topic that you can think of. And there were also pieces that were made to celebrate the holidays. Thanksgiving and Christmas were popular ones. There were just all sorts of different various bars that were made, but these were made for collectors, a booming new collectible of a silver art bar. These were typically 1 troy ounce, 999 fine silver, and that's really kind of the birth of everything that we're doing right now. For collectors, for silver stackers, it all kind of begins with these types of silver art bars. 999 silver in 1 troy ounce bars is kind of what we know now. But this was a kind of a new vehicle when it first came on the scene, and they were wildly collectible and popular for that brief period of time. This is an example of one that I've pulled aside. You've heard me talk before about quality and condition. So this isn't necessarily a scarce one. This is made by the USSC, which I think is United States Silver Corporation. This dates to 1973, and it's the Barbary Coast. But what attracted me to this bar is just a really beautiful image on the front and also the back. Unusual in that it's got both sides that have been minted, and it's just a beautiful bar. So lots of these have cycled through my physical bullion holdings over the years, and I have cycled out of a lot of these too, and sometimes I regret it because some of these pieces are really just beautiful. This is a Thanksgiving bar done by the Artistic Silver Company. This is a celebration of the first Thanksgiving. This one also dates to 1973. Here's a more common bar. You've probably seen this if you've ever looked at silver art bars. I think this one is Madison Mint, 1972. So again, those early 1970 period holiday or just historic commemorative type bars. These were a nice way for the average consumer to have 999 pure silver, and these were displayed. People would put them on their mantle, they'd put them in binders, show them off to friends, and they were collecting clubs. About the time that I really got earnest about collecting and stacking silver, the early to late 1980s, mid 1980s, these were really kind of the looked down on by most silver stackers. They were seen as something that, your strange uncle had a collection of. They went right into the dealer's melt buckets, and looking back now in retrospect, it's kind of a shame. These were pioneering 999 silver vehicles. Some of them were incredibly scarce. A lot of them had serial numbers on the side, so a lot of the things that we take for granted, 1 troy ounce, 999 silver, serial numbers, that all really kind of began with these silver art bars. As I said, they kind of went up to about 1975, and then they start disappearing. What happened in 1975? Well, preparations were being made for the bicentennial. So there were, for example, the Mint was still making silver collectibles for people who were really interested in collecting silver. And as an example, the silver Ike dollars, the Eisenhower dollars, they were made in 40% silver from 1971 to 1974. The U.S. Mint made those brown and blue pack Ikes. That's what they're called. And they made about 20 million of those 40% silver Eisenhower dollars. In 1976, they made almost as many as they had made in the previous 4 years. They made 15 million silver Ikes, and the Mint made the silver quarter and the silver half as well. So all of a sudden, the market was flooded with medals and keepsakes and bars and coins and mementos. Everything you can imagine was made out of silver for the bicentennial. And I think that really kind of spelled the death knell for silver art bars. Some of them continued a little bit later than that, but I think by that time the market had kind of shifted away from it, and that takes us up to the next level. Again, 1, silver art bars, 2, industrial. This is kind of a departure from the art bars because for the most part, these industrial metal bars were not made for collectors. They were often a little bit more crude. They didn't have fancy designs on them. They weren't made to be displayed. The pieces that were made by the refineries around the country and around the world were simply a way to recycle silver as it had been used in photographic equipment, in silver negatives and silver salts used in photography. And then there was all sorts of silver that was used in electrical components, early electronics, automotive, aeronautical. There was lots of silver that was being used in industry. And there still is some to this day, but it was to a greater extent in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. So there were refineries that were built all over this country that used local sourced recycled material and created their own bars. So these, in a way, predate the art bars, but they weren't really made for consumers. A lot of these companies, these small refineries, some of them were quite small mom and pop type stores that just used local product. They were making silver bars for industry. So most of the time, these bars were a little bit more crude. Sometimes these refineries didn't last very long. We have sometimes they would last as few as little as a couple of months making these products and then disappeared. So we know something about some of these industrial bar makers, but some of them are still a mystery waiting to be solved. And their bars a little bit more crude, certainly not meant to be displayed, but no less interesting to the collector. And I've mentioned before that sometimes those pieces that aren't meant to be collected are the ones that wind up being a little bit more interesting later because they weren't saved. These things were used in industry. They were used by jewelry makers. They were used by anybody who needed silver. This industrial form of silver is still collectible to an extent. Here's an example of a little bit later piece. This is a piece by Panama City's Southeast Refining. You can find these in 5-ounce and even 10-ounce, I believe they put out bars. But this refinery was only around for about 2 or 3 years, from about 1980 to about 1982, 83. I was fortunate enough to stumble upon an entire group of about 20 of those bars with serial numbers that are in order, and I snapped those up about 10 or 15 years ago. I think they're kind of neat. A good example of a local, smaller industrial refinery. Again, not meant to be displayed. They weren't meant to be collectible. This was just a way to buy silver ounce bars. Here's another one. This is out of Indianapolis. This is CMW, I believe it is. And again, an attractive bar in its own right, but certainly not something that was ever meant to be displayed and collected. This one notable because it's got a very low serial number. I don't know if you can see it there at the bottom where it's starting to tone. And here's another example. This one is by HCJ Refiners. Again, lots of these smaller refineries were making these bars from recovered, recycled materials. So on one hand, you've got silver art bars. On the next hand, you've got these industrial bars. And then you have something that happened about the end of between the bicentennial and the creation of the Susan B. Anthony dollar in 1979. And what is that? We've talked about it before, and that is the Hunt brothers cornering the silver market. So focus of the entire world was all of a sudden on silver, while people had been collecting the silver art bars for several years, and these refineries had been around for many decades in some cases and producing these smaller bars. It was a phenomenon where silver had gone from being worth $2 or maybe $3 an ounce to being worth $50 an ounce, and it seemed like it happened almost overnight. Suddenly the eyes of the world were on silver and gold, but there were lots of banking companies that started producing products not for collectors and not for industry, but as an investment. Remember, coins were no longer an option for most people. 999 silver became something that people wanted. So the third branch of that tree that we're working on now is the investment or banking side of the equation. And there was certainly some crossover between the two. This bar is an earlier bar by Anglo-American Mines. Anglo-American is the parent company of De Beers. So this is a nice little chunky bar. It's a little bit unusual in the way that it's shaped. It's not quite the standard that a lot of these bars seem to be. This bar is kind of one of the early examples of that banking side of the equation, the investment side. This is a Sharps Pixley bar from the UK. Sharps Pixley was one of the 5 firms that got together every day to set the London gold price. That's the way they used to do it in the old times before there were lots of internet-related sites that traded gold and silver and posted the prices. These firms would literally get together 2 times a day sometimes in London and set the world price for gold. Sharps Pixley was one of those companies. Another one of those companies that got together of those 5 families was Johnson Matthey. And there was another one called there was the Rothschilds, there was the Montagues, and there was another one called Mikado and Goldschmidt. And we'll talk about Mikado and Goldschmidt in a later video. We've got some earlier products from theirs. They're a fascinating story as well. But back to the investment side of the equation, you could see a market shift from companies that had been involved in these industrial silver products. And this is a great example. This is an early Engelhard bar. It's going to come as no surprise that I've got some early Engelhard pieces that kind of work in this equation too. You know from the earlier videos, I'm a big fan of Engelhard and Johnson Matthey. All Engelhard says that this is one of their first bars, one of their first 1 ounce bars made for the consumer. This dates to the late 60s, early 70s. Shortly after this series came out, in this series they released maybe a total of 30,000 bars. This was the next one that came from Engelhard, or pretty close to it, and they made about 800,000 of these. So you can see how rapidly things shifted from being kind of an industrial supplier of refined silver to something that was being driven by consumer demand on the investment side. Johnson Matthey, we've talked about them many times before. Johnson Matthey produced some early bars that were kind of crude by comparison, and this clearly shows a finished product. Was this made to show off? Not really. It's not like a silver art bar. Was it made to be melted again? I suppose you could, but that's not really what this bar existed for. This is an investment vehicle. This was a way for the investor to own physical silver. Again, that delineation between those three branches of the same tree that we're talking about. If you've watched the earlier videos, you of course know that I'm a big fan of the Manfra, Tordella, and Brooks pieces. We talked about the rounds, and I showed off a 10-ounce version of that round in the last video on 999 silver coins. So of course I've got some of their bars too. This one is interesting because this bar, made for Manfrella, Tordella, and Brooks, Manfra, Tordella, and Brooks, the MTD company, was made by Medallic Arts, the same company that made those large silver medals from the last video. This is an example of the same bar made by Johnson Matthey. Clearly not an unattractive bar. I find this a very attractive bar, but it's not really a silver art bar. This is an investment vehicle. So some examples of how some of the companies that had been involved with refining, who had been involved with making industrial silver products, were clearly shifting after that fascination with silver prices and the Hunt brothers of the early 1980s to creating something that was showing those consumers who wanted to have investment vehicles of 999 pure silver that this was kind of the new era. And really quickly, as we've gone over these three trees of the past history of some of these deeper dives to 1 ounce bars, I am fascinated with kind of the new era. People that have been stacking and collecting recently and who haven't really dived deeply into the older bars. You're probably familiar with the Germania Mint or the new Britannia bars that are coming out from the London Mint. I've touched on those in some of the previous videos. There are lots of people who are making those retro poured silver bars in different shapes and shapes of guns and arrowheads and movie stars and cartoon characters. That is almost kind of a hybrid of all of this stuff. Their Germania bars in particular, I think, are very, very pretty bars. Some of them are designed to be displayed. So they have an element of an art bar to them, but they are also denominated in troy ounce 999 silver. They are clearly an investment vehicle as well. It's a wonderful hybrid, a wonderful time to be involved in this kind of new frontier of 999 silver for the person who wants to own physical silver. So 3 branches of the tree plus new sprouts that are coming out: silver art bars, industrial bars, and banking bars. That's how I see them. Some people classify them differently. There are no right or wrong answers. This is just one that makes sense to me. If you like this video and you have any comments or suggestions, please drop them below. If you have found this information useful, I really hope that you'll subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to me, and it means that we're putting out the information that people really seem to appreciate. If you have any suggestions of new videos that you'd like to see me make as we go along here, if there's other topics you'd like to see me cover, I'd be happy to take a look at it, evaluate it, and see if I've got enough knowledge and product that I can share with everyone to make it worthwhile. And as always, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of your journey as you go deeper into the world of physical precious metals.